All right, let's finally start addressing the issue of arms growing on the cactus. Let's come over to our one segment node, possibly our most important node, and let's give it a new input and output, a floating point value called arm probability. And let's wire that up from input to output, but first I need to get these a little further away from the main band of inputs headed toward outputs. Okay. And also let's give this a new output, a Boolean value called hasArm. So arm probability is going to be the probability that any given segment will sprout an arm, and hasArm will indicate whether or not this particular segment has or doesn't have an arm, and that will be determined using that probability value. Before we implement the nodes that govern the arm, let's come back out of here and let's plumb that arm probability value through the chain as per normal, and we'll first create a cactus level input called arm probability as well. All right, let's come back into one segment and let's determine whether any given segment has an arm. So to do that, we're going to need one of our random number generator nodes. We can just clone an existing one. And we're going to need our arm probability, our object for random number generator, our ID, and that's it. So let's bring those values down into the vicinity of the node. All right, object for random number generator and ID plug in here as per usual. And let's set an offset value of 0.2. I don't think we've used that value yet. Now, what we're going to do is generate a number between 0 and 100 as a percentage, and compare that against the arm probability, which will also be a number between 0 and 100. Well, in fact, let's make it between 0 and 1, where 0 is a 0% chance, 1 is a 100% chance. So let's set an initial value of 0, which is the default, and a magnitude of, say, 1000. Again, just a large number. 1000 is good. It's a multiple of 100. It'll do. Probably 100 would do just fine as well. So let's take the output of that and turn it into a number between 0 and 100. And the way we can do that is with a math node using the modulo function. We will take the value and do modulo 100. And I will change the name to modulo 100. And then to convert that number to a number between 0 and 1, we just divide by 100. And now if we want to know whether or not we have an arm, we will use a compare node to compare this to our arm probability. And we'll use the greater than function, which is the default function. So we just want to know whether our arm probability is greater than this value that we've generated. If it is, then we have an arm. So let's name our output, as we often do, and let's name it hasArm. And let's plumb hasArm all the way to the hasArm output of our overall node. Now let's create a node that will represent one arm of the cactus. We'll come back out to our cactus node and select all of the nodes except the input and the output. Right-click and copy. And then just add two math nodes group them, delete them, and paste what we copied. Bring the input down near the first node, bring the output up close to the last node. The only output we care about is the geometry, so we just hook that up in the usual way. And with regard to the inputs, luckily we do not have to tell Blender the types and names of these inputs. It will figure that out just by creating a connection like this. So let's do it for all of them. Great. Let's come back out to this level and let's name this node arm. Now make a copy of one of our one segment nodes and highlight it and the new arm node and create a new group. Let's come back out and let's come back out of that and name the group right away. Let's call it seg and arm. This is going to represent a segment of the cactus and possibly an arm growing from that segment. So we need all of the same inputs that we had already, and we're going to create those the same way we did just a moment ago. And then all of the outputs from our one segment are also going to give rise to outputs for this seg and arm node. And in the same way, just drag to create connections and they'll automatically have the correct types and the correct names. Add one more output called arms of type geometry. And plug our arm node's output into that socket. Now let's take a look at this hasArm value coming out of our one segment. That's determining whether or not this arm should even be present. So that doesn't actually need to be an output that we pass on to the next segment in the cactus. So let's remove that output. hasArm, goodbye. But let's use hasArm to gate whether or not we are going to show the output from this arm node. And we've seen this a couple times already before. We will use a switch node. Like this, we want to show the arm if hasArm is true, so we'll plug it into the true socket. And hasArm is our condition. Also, our arm node has a start tilt. 0 is a value meaning that the arm would start growing in a straight upward orientation. But I think the arm of the cactus should grow horizontally outward from the main stem. And so let's give it a value of pi. The more mathematically inclined among you might be wondering why I've set the start tilt to a value of pi, since in radians that would correspond to 180 degrees, meaning that the arm would begin sprouting in a downward direction rather than a horizontal direction. So why isn't this pi over 2? So let me try to explain why I've done it that way. So the cactus arms are the same structure as the main cactus stem. They're composed of a bunch of these segments, and they are rounded off at the top and rounded off at the bottom. And where they're rounded off at the bottom, which is where the arm of the cactus would sprout from the stem, those first few segments are rather small. And so they adjust toward vertical fairly quickly. And so by the time they have, reached the halfway point or reached a certain number of segments out, they're already pointing sort of vertically. And so it won't really appear as though they come out of the cactus at 90 degrees. So let's see if I can illustrate that just using this cactus that we've got here. So I'm just going to get rid of our tilt severity temporarily. I'm going to set that to 0, so that's not going to confuse us. And I'm going to turn up the length to 2 just to make a much more obvious vertical stem. And then I'm going to duplicate this cactus. I'm going to bring the starting point of this new cactus, which will be our stand-in for a cactus arm, to a little bit sort of inside the cactus. It's not going to sprout right from the surface. And in reality, we're not going to use a value of 2 for the length. That just doesn't look right to me. It'll be closer to somewhere between 0.5 and 1. So let me set it to, yeah, that's too little. Let me set it to 1. Now let's play with that start tilt value. So let's set that to a value of pi over 2, which is really 90 degrees. Right? And you can see that the arm, this makeshift arm, appears to come out of the cactus not really horizontally, already sort of 45 degrees upward. And if I set it to a value of pi, then we get something maybe slightly downward, but closer to horizontal. And later on, we're going to add more segments, not only to the stem of our cactus, but also to the arms. So at the moment, we just have 8 and 8 here, but we can have way more, like 32. So what will happen is this arm will actually tend to grow upwards, and it'll take that sort of stereotypical shape that you would expect of an arm coming out of a cactus and then orienting itself upward. And yeah, that value can be tweaked. There's nothing special about the value pi. It could be 3 or 2.8 or whatever. So that's a value that you'll be free to play with to make the arms sprout in a way that you find more aesthetic. But anyway, that's the reason why I've gone with a value of pi. Also, this arms output is really going to gather up all of the cactus arms together in the same way that we gathered up the individual segments to make a full cactus, and we gathered up all of the individual buds to make a assemblage of all of the buds. And so it should be an input here as well, so that it can be plumbed all the way through our cactus. So let's add that as an input and make sure that it will get plumbed all the way through. So to do that, we're going to need to join the new arm with a collection of all of the arms that have been made so far. And for that, we need another join node. Oh, pardon me. We need a join geometry node, like this. Next, we want to add a few new outputs to our one segment node. One of them will be to tell the arm when its growth began, because our cactus begins its growth at growth value 0, but our arm begins growing a little later on, maybe halfway through the life cycle of the cactus or whatever. So one segment should tell the arm when it should begin growing. So let's just briefly jump into one segment. And we won't compute the value here, but, I mean, we will soon. But for now, let's just add this as an output. It'll be a floating point value, and then let's call it arm growth start. We also need to tell the arm where to start growing, and that's a vector output. So let's create a new vector output called arm location. Again, we will back it up with some computations soon. We also need to tell the arm what its tilt axis is, because it won't necessarily be the same as that of the parent stem. And again, that is a vector as well. Now we can come back out of our one segment. We will return to it in a bit. Now, in order to grow properly, our cactus arm doesn't just need to know what the current growth value is. It needs to know at what growth value it began growing. So we're going to need to add that as a new input. So let's just quickly jump into our arm node and add that new input. And again, we will back up that input or process that input very soon with some computation. But for now, let's just add it. Add it to the bottom, and we'll call it growth start. We can come back out of our arm node, and here we are. We have arm growth start coming out of our node up here, and let's feed that into growth start for our arm node. arm location, we want to feed that into the start center of our arm. And arm tilt axis, we want that to go to the tilt axis input. So the next step is, let's clean up these 3 lines so that they follow my usual right angle pattern. And then all of these other inputs are going to come from the corresponding outputs on this node in the manner that you would expect. So let's do all that wiring now. Okay, so a few things about this wiring. We've left start tilt alone because, as we discussed, we're setting that to a value of pi, or something around pi. The ID, that's a whole separate issue which we'll get into soon, but let's skip it for now. For buds, we don't have any buds being collected here, and again, that's another issue we will cover very soon. And then a few other things worth mentioning. I've plugged end radius into start radius. Well, that isn't quite right, and we're going to come back to that as well. I've plugged end twist into start twist, and once again, that also isn't quite right, but we will come back to it. And finally, I've plugged arm probability in as well. We're not going to use that because in the structure of Cactus that I'm creating here, I'm not going to have arms sprouting from the arms. But for anyone feeling ambitious and comfortable enough who wants to do that, well, here's arm probability. Everything you need is available. You just need to go one level deeper in terms of the nesting. But that's not something I'm going to cover. I'm perfectly happy with one main stem that grows arms. Let's address a couple of those inputs for the arm node that I said weren't quite right. So specifically the length that we're using as the length input on the arm, and the radius input for the arm. Where's that one? Here, start radius. Let me just, in fact, pull both of those aside a little so I don't have to go hunting for them again. It's quite a lot of inputs. Yeah, so the radius and the length of a particular segment in the cactus will vary, right? Because we have a shrink factor that makes the cactus a little bit smaller with each new segment in the chain. And also the age of the cactus is going to have an effect on this. Like as the cactus grows from growth value 0 up to some maximum, these values are going to get larger. So we're going to make a distinction here between that initial or true or main value of length and radius and the length and radius that a particular segment happens to have at a particular time. So let's pull up the panel for this segment and arm node, and let's give it 2 new inputs and 2 new outputs. They're going to be floating point values, and let's name them main length and main radius, and those will refer to those unchanging constant values for the overall cactus. And now let's plumb those through from the input to the output. And then let's use those values as the input to the arm node instead of grabbing these 2 outputs from our 1 segment node. Now let's come out of this node back to the entire cactus, and let's recreate this chain of 8 that we have here, and let's do it with our new
segment and arm node instead. Remember, it's a matter of linking two of them, copying the entire set of 2, and then creating one new link, copying the entire set of 4, and then creating one new link for a full set of 8. Now we can delete our old group of 8 one-segment nodes and replace them with our chain of 8 segment and arm nodes. Quickly make note that at the end we want to grab the body geometry and plug it in here, and the buds geometry and plug it in here, and then we'll deal with the arms in a moment. And for the input, remember, we don't need the geometry input since we're building the cactus from scratch. And now we can come back to main length and main radius. We'll just make sure that those inputs get the same length and radius values that we're feeding into our very first segment and arm node.
Let's come back into our second arm node and then into our arm node. And what we're doing now is we're going to get rid of the buds input because it is not needed anymore. So we can delete it, but it does remain on the one segment node. It's simply gone as an input here. Oh, we should do the very same thing with the body so far input as well. Next, let's compute a reasonable growth start time for the arm. That's an output that comes from the one segment node, so let's go inside that node. We just make the output node a little larger so we can read everything. It's this output here. It's going to be somewhat random. So what I'm going to do is actually take our object for random number generator and our ID from here and just extend that downward. Maybe a little further just to really separate things, and duplicate an existing random number generator node. And we can plug in the object for random number generator and the ID in the usual way. We also want the number of cap segments and the growth limit. Well, the number of cap segments is one of these integer green inputs, this one here. And the growth limit is this value right here. And so what follows is a bit of math that I'd worked out a while ago. And the general idea that I had in mind was that I don't want arms sprouting from the rounded off top of the cactus. And for a particular segment, I'd prefer the arm to sort of begin growing sometime between, the first appearance of that segment and the final growth value, like the end of the life cycle of the cactus. And so that's what this math will do. And it goes like this. So we're going to multiply cap segments by 2. And we're going to add the ID to that. And from there, we will subtract that value from the growth limit. We'll take the maximum of that and 0 using the maximum function on a math node. We will divide that by 4, division function, math node. And then we will add this value to that. The output of that node will be the initial value for our random number generator, and the value coming out of the divide node will be the magnitude. Let's connect that to the output. And then let's clean things up as usual. Let's use this new arm growth start value to work out what the actual growth value should be, or the effective growth value should be for the arm. So the arm has its growth start, and it also has the overall growth value for the cactus. So let's use those to compute a growth value for the arm. So we need to bring down growth and growth start. Then we just subtract growth start from growth. And we take the maximum of that value and 0. Maximum function, math node. Let's call that arm growth, and let's use that in place of the growth value. Now let's implement some computation that will give our arms their tilt axis and their start center. That is, where we're going to place the arm on the cactus, and also an axis that will allow that arm to tilt upward. So those values are the outputs that we added but never backed up in our one segment node. So let's get back to our one segment node. And over here where we have reused the ID and the object for random number generator to generate this arm growth related value here, let's just repeat that process to get yet another random number generator down here. Oh, incidentally, it looks like we haven't given either of these proper offset. So I'm just going to go with, let's say, 0.4. This is really not that important, but just I like to have it different for each one. Yeah, so let's extend this down and have one more random number generator. So this random number generator is going to tell us the angle where we want the arm to be sprouting on the particular segment of the cactus. So if you imagine looking down on the cross-section of the cactus, it's just some direction like the minute hand of a clock, somewhere 0 degrees to 360 degrees. So initial value of 0 is fine, and since we're picking an angle, we're in that situation again where I'm perfectly happy to just pick a really large number, like 1,000. After all, if you go beyond 360 degrees or 2 pi radians, you just come back to where you start, so large number is fine. And let's give that a name. Let's call it the arm angle. All right, so we're going to use that angle with a vector rotate node. So yes, that is the angle input on a vector rotate node. And the vector that we're going to rotate is a vector that basically points sideways, something that points horizontal. So let's just create a vector like this, and let's name it sideways. And let's just set it to a 1 on the y-axis, and everything else is 0. And yeah, we'll count that as a sideways vector. That's the vector that we're going to rotate around the vertical axis. And the vertical axis here is the default, so this node is set. We're ready. And let's call the output of that the arm direction. Now, if you imagine again looking down on that cross-section of the main cactus stem and imagining that you can see a line from the center of that cross-section outward to the point on the outside of the cactus where we're going to sprout an arm. rotate that 90 degrees, and that's a suitable tilt axis for the arm. So that's exactly how we're going to compute the tilt axis, is we're just going to grab another vector rotate node, and we're going to literally rotate the arm direction vector by 90 degrees, and that'll be our tilt axis. And we're rotating it around the vertical axis again, so the default is fine. And here we can enter 90. And let's call that the arm tilt axis. Let's go ahead and plumb arm tilt axis all the way to the output, since this value is ready now. And yeah, over here I'm going to do something a little unusual. I'm going to add a reroute node just temporarily here for the sake of collapsing those three values. And the reason I'm doing that is just so that I can line up this arm tilt axis with its output socket and have it be in the right place. Yeah, that's fine like that. Okay, next let's take our arm direction and bring it over to here where we have some free space to do what we want. In fact, I'll bring it even a little further over. And there are several other values that we need. So the first is we need the start radius. So we actually need the start radius and the end radius. So let's find that and plumb it around to this vicinity. So start radius and end radius. And we also want the start center and the end center. So with these 5 inputs, we can compute the arm's location. So on a segment, we will have the arm sprout halfway up, so halfway between the top and the bottom of the segment. So we have our start center and our end center. Let's just find the midpoint between them. So all we need for that is a mix node. And we don't want to mix floats, we want to mix vectors. And we want to mix them with a factor of 0.5, so we leave that at the default. And we'll just plug in our end center and our start center. And we need the radius at that point in the segment. And that's also just halfway between the start radius and the end radius. So we just need another mix node. But radius is a float, so let's go back to float. And again, the default is a mix of 50-50. We will plug in our start radius and our end radius. Now you may recall that I said before that we are not actually going to have the arm sprout directly on the surface of the cactus. It's going to sprout a little bit on the inside. So we're going to take that radius and shrink it a little, and that'll pull the point where we're going to sprout the arm into the cactus a bit. We're going to multiply it by 0.65. So I'm going to add a value node, and I'm going to call it tweak. It's tweaking the position of the arm. And let's set it to 0.65, and then we just need a math node with the multiplication function, and we are going to multiply our tweak value by that radius that we computed. And now remember, we have a vector called arm direction that points us from the center of the cactus toward the outside, the point where the arm should sprout. So all we need to do is scale that arm direction by our new radius value. So we need vector math, and we need the scale function like that. And now we just add that to our value here. That's the halfway point along the midline of the cactus. So another vector math node, but instead of scale, we use add. And we will add our scaled vector to our midpoint. And now we have the arm location. Let's give it a name. And let's connect it to the output and then do our usual cleanup. Let's come back out of here and revisit our ARM node. So one thing that the ARM node doesn't actually need is the start twist. So we can actually get rid of that. We can have it start at a twist value of 0. That's just fine. So delete that as a connection, and then go in and actually delete the input. And we can see that the first one segment node inside of our ARM is going to get a start twist value of 0, which is fine. Next, let's deal with the issue of those ID values in the segments. So you hopefully recall that in a chain of segments we have unique ID values for each segment, starting with 0 and then 1 and then 2, etc. And those values are being used for two purposes. Number one, they're being used for random number generation, and number two, they're being used for growth-related and size-related computations. So here inside of an ARM, it would be nice if we could have unique values for when we are using IDs for random number generation, but for growth-related computations, it would be nice if the first segment in the ARM had an ID of 0, and the next one had an ID of 1, etc., just like the stem, or just like the main part of the cactus. And so we're going to make that happen. So we're going to come inside of our one segment here, and actually let me just come out quickly because this is worth mentioning here. Recall how we took the actual growth value and the start growth value of the ARM, and from that computed a special growth value, which is used within the ARM. So we're going to do the same for IDs. We're going to have the ID of the particular segment in the ARM, but we're also going to have the ID of the first segment in the ARM, so that we can get the difference, and that difference will be 0, 1, 2, etc. So let's add an input called the base ID. And let's add it as an output as well. And let's connect the input to the output. And then let's use that base ID to compute the, let's call it the relative ID. The relative ID will be the one that we will use for growth-related computations, and the usual ID will be the one that we'll use for random number generation. So we will need those two values. And we need only subtract the base ID from the ID to get the relative ID. And then we'll do the same little plan that we had done before in a couple of places, which is that we will bring relative ID right up close to the line for ID and have it follow along. And then we can just use relative ID in the cases where we're doing growth-related computations, and we will use the ID proper when we are doing random number-related computations.
Next, let's give all of the segments in the arms unique segment IDs, unique ID values, by computing an arm ID as an output for one segment that we can feed to the arm node. So that's a new output of type float called arm ID. And one way to make it unique, or close enough to unique that it's good enough, is to take the next ID value and multiply it by 100. And we'll make that the first segment ID of an arm if this one segment happens to sprout an arm. So let's come back out to here. And I really want one segment from here. And we will take the arm ID output we just created, plug it into the ID socket on the arm. And then the arm also needs that base ID value. But that's not an input. It's not a new input. It is the very same ID that we just added. And now we should make sure that base ID is plumbed all the way through our segments.
Let's take a look at our arm progress so far. But to do that, there is one thing finally missing. At the end of our cactus chain, we're not actually doing anything with the arms yet. So let's combine them with everything else in this join geometry node. So let's jump over to this view where arm probability is 0, and let's increase it to 0.2. And also, right now we have 5 cap segments, which is a value that I like, but we will have more opportunity to see arms if we reduce that a bit. So I'll set it down to 3. You can see a couple of arms sticking out of the bottom here. And if I drag upward on the grow value, we'll see them get larger. We'll see new arms springing up on the surface in various places. All the way to this monstrosity. Now let me take the growth value back down to, say, 11. And the fact that these are, like this one in particular, is not even touching the surface of the main cactus, that tells me that we are using the wrong radius values when we are positioning our arms. So let's go and fix that. Jump into our segment and arm node. And it's this output right here, arm location. That is where we are positioning the arms. So let's go inside here and let's find where we did that math. It's these purple vector lines, arm location. Right there. So here it is. And we have our 2 radius values that we're using as our inputs. And they are coming from our end radius and our start radius. Well, notice that with our start radius we had that secondary value here, which was the actual start radius value that is being used when constructing a segment. So let's use that instead. Quickest way to do that might just be like that. Let's see if that alone is enough or whether there is another value that needs to be tweaked. Yep, there is another value that needs to be tweaked. I'll try to find this by working backwards from the place where we actually construct the cactus, which is here. And we have an S value for the end radius. That is the version of end radius that we actually need. So let's find where that came from by just walking it backwards. It's this value right here. So let's use that as our end radius instead. And I'm just going to rename that as actual end radius. This is the value we want here. Should be able to delete that and that. And let's have a look now. If we go inside this cactus, we should see that, yep, these arms are sprouting from a position which is on the inside. That's what we want. I'm actually not much of a fan of arms sprouting from this bottom rounded section, so we can take care of that easily enough by modifying our condition for has arms. In fact, let's just do that now. So here's where we're computing has arm. It's coming all the way over from here. And so let's just add another condition. So for that, we want a Boolean operation, Boolean math. We want two things to be true. And the function for that is called AND, intuitively enough. So what do we want to be true? Well, we want the ID of the segment to be greater than cap segments, or greater than or equal to the number of cap segments. Right? If we have 5 cap segments, that means that we won't have any arm on segment 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And after that, we're welcome to have arms. And that seems like the solution to this problem. So we will take our ID value, which is right here. Let's use relative ID, even though it's not so important when we're dealing with the main stem, but let's use it anyway. And let's check whether the relative ID is greater than or equal to the cap segments, which is right there. Oh, right here. And so if both of these things are true, then we will say we have an arm. Before I clean up, let's quickly have a look. Great. Arms at the bottom are gone. And if we allow the cactus to keep growing, we will still see arms, but they're just further up. So let's just clean this up. At the moment, our main cactus stem has 8 segments, and arms also have 8 segments. But once we're finished with all of the circuitry and the wiring, we're going to increase the number of segments, both in the arms and also in the main stem. But we might not necessarily want the same number of segments in both cases. Me personally, I think I'm going to go with 32 segments in the main stem and maybe 16 in each arm. So that means we will need a different growth limit for the stem versus the arm. So let's make growth limit a input and an output of our one segment. And that way we can have different values for the main stem and for the arm. First, as usual, since we've created a new input and a new output that are a matching pair, let's connect them. All right, and now let's use that growth limit value instead of this value node here. Now let's come out of here. And the growth limit for the arm, we can now have that as an input. So let's get into our arm. And let's add growth limit as an input. And connect it. And plumb it through. Now come back out of arm. And let's add a value node. Let's call it arm growth limit. Let's set it to 8. For now. Later when we add more segments to our arms, we'll come back here and adjust it again. And now for our segment and arm node, let's add the same input and output. So we'll go from the input to the one segment node. And from the one segment node to the output. Then we'll come back out to our cactus. And again, let's add a value node. Let's call it cactus main stem growth limit. Also a value of 8. And plumb it through. And now the two can be controlled independently. Let's make another adjustment to the way that cactuses grow. So at the moment, the rounding off at the bottom of the top of the cactus and the shrink factor affects the overall size of segments in the cactus. But it would be nice if the cactus also if its overall proportions changed, increased as it grows. So let's make that happen. And so here we are in the cactus node, and in order to do this, we're going to need 4 inputs. The growth limit, the length, and the start radius. So let's bring them down here where we can add some nodes to do the computation. So that's the growth limit, the length, and the start radius. And we're going to use these inputs to compute a new value for length and a new value for the start radius, so that when the cactus is very young, those values are small, and as it reaches its full size, those values reach full size. So we're going to bring in a map range node, and we'll plug the growth in as the value input. And then the from min can be 0, the from max can be the growth limit. And then the to min and the to max can be 0 and 1. And then we just multiply the output of this by the length and the start radius to get the, let's call it the length for age and the start radius for age. And let's replace start radius and length with start radius for age and length for age. And then we're going to do the same thing in the arm. So let's turn this into a node of its own. That first input is growth. That's the input that is feeding its way into the value socket of the map range node. The second input should be the growth limit, which goes into the from max socket. At the moment, that's the fourth input, so let's change the ordering to make it the second. And then the third and the fourth should be the length and the start radius, and that is already the case. And let's name these outputs. Let's call them length for age and start radius for age. Let's come out and let's name this node age adjustments. Let's tidy this up. And let's do the same with the arm node. So we'll come inside our seg and arm, inside our arm node, and then after we've computed arm growth, we will bring in one of these new nodes to adjust length and radius. So again, we need length, we need start radius, we need growth, in this case arm growth, and we also need the growth limit, which is an input. And I realize we haven't given the inputs on this node proper names. Let's fix that. It should be growth, and then growth limit, length, and start radius. That's better. Now let's come back out to the layout view here. And in fact, let's switch over to the shading workspace. And let's change from Eevee to cycles. And swap over to this view here, the rendered view. Let's insert a light, specifically a sunlight. Just rotate it, put it at a bit of an angle. Getting close so we can see what we're doing. And there is already a material here. If there isn't, click the plus button to create one. I'm just going to go very basic on this material. This tutorial is more about constructing the cactus with geometry nodes than texturing it or shading it. So I'm just going to pick a green, a little bit closer to the yellow than to the blue, and make it a bit of a dark green. And let's quickly come over to the geometry nodes. Let's name the material first. Let's call it green. Okay. Now let's jump back to geometry nodes. We're in the cactus node. And here we have the cactus main stem geometry, the buds on the main stem, and then the arms. So right here after the set shade smooth, let's add a set material node. And set it to green. Let's copy that node, go and find our arm node, and do the same thing here. Alright, let's come back out, and we can see that our cactus is green. That's maybe a little bit too dark for my liking. Yeah, that's a bit better. Might be a little too saturated. Okay, I like that. And under subsurf radius, let's just set everything to 1. And let's go for a subsurf of 0.05. So just a tiny bit of subsurf. And now let's hide the cactus, show the bud object, and give it a couple of materials as well. So let's go to our X-ray view, look from the side. Edit mode, or in face select mode, good, that's what I want. and highlight all these lower faces. Actually, I don't need to do it this way, do I? I can just create a new material. It should automatically be assigned to all faces. Let's just leave it at the default white. I think that'll be fine. And let's switch back over to solid and highlight everything but the spikes. Invert the selection under select, invert, and let's create a new material, and let's make it a light brown. Let's assign so we can see it. Let's rename these materials to white and brown. And I can come out of edit mode now. This is still a bit too light. Let me make it a bit darker. Yeah, that'll do. And let's turn the roughness down on that. Maybe somewhere between 0.1 and 0.2. Closer to 0.1 maybe. Let's hide the bud again, show the cactus again. And that'll do for now as far as basic material goes. Having looked at the cactus now in its current state, I feel like the bud spines should be a little bit longer. So I'm just going to quickly make an adjustment there. Okay, I think that's a little better. Now let's double the number of segments in the arms and quadruple the number of segments in the main branch, or the main stem. Let's start with the arm. Again, mental note, we plug the body into here and we plug the buds into here. And just copy all of the segment nodes, duplicate them, and link them. Next, let's quadruple the number of segments in the main branch, or the main stem. Same process, we just do it twice. Next, let's come back to this window and go to the geometry nodes, and this is where we're going to change the growth limits to adjust for the new number of segments that we have. So here we are in Cactus, so let's adjust the growth limit for that. It should now be 32. Let's just make sure that that is a suitable number. While we're doing that, we should also have the growth value be large enough that we can see the full growth. So I'll set it to 40. Of course, we're getting a lot of arms. In fact, before I do that, I think arm probabilities may be a bit too high. Because of the way our random number generator works, 0.1 is not really exactly a 10% chance. It's clearly much higher. Doesn't mean we can't play with the number to reduce it anyway. Well, we have a problem with the way we're computing arm probability. Alright, that's an easy one to fix. Let's get into the one segment node where we are using arm probability here, where we've taken this random number, we've done modulo 100 and we've divided it by 100. We are missing a math node with the absolute function. And it should sit right in between these two. And now we should be able to adjust arm probability and have it be a little more sensible. Before we got sidetracked there, we were adjusting the growth limits. So let's come back out of here, go back to our cactus. We've already made growth larger than the number of segments, so we can work our way down from there. Let's go to the top of the cactus. Yes, it is open. We don't want that. Let's just make sure that 32 really is the value that closes the hole. Yep, value of 32 does it. Okay, so exactly the number of segments. And let's do the same for the arm. Here's the arm growth limit. And we'll need a fully grown arm, so let me just make sure growth is really high. Let's say 100. So this should be 16. Yep. Those arms are a little bit too big, and I think I know what we can do to make them smaller. Here's how we're going to fix it. Over here, where we are taking the main radius and the main length, or the true radius and the true length, and feeding that into the arm, let's sort of lie to the arm and give it a smaller value. So I'm just going to make a little bit of space like this, and I'm going to drag these over here, and then let's take the actual end length and end radius, or the length and end radius coming out of our one segment node, and mix that with these true values, skewed more closely to the values coming out of here than to the true values. So let's grab length and let's grab end radius. All right, and let's get a mix node. And let's just drop it on the line here where length is. And let's get another one and drop it on the main radius line. And let's mix our length with our main length, mix our end radius with our main radius. Let's shift our view here so we can see what's happening as well. Already the arms are slightly smaller because the default mix is 50-50. But I want to skew that mix a little bit differently. So let's bring in another value node. And I'll just call that the mix amount. And I'm going to set that all the way up to 0.8. So it will mostly be taking the length and the main radius from what's coming out of the one segment node. Great. And now here at the base of the main cactus, where the main cactus is thicker, the arm is thicker. And up here where the main stem of the cactus is thinner, the arm is thinner. All right, one more thing. I don't really find that that's the kind of horizontal outcropping of an arm that I originally wanted. And so I'm going to drop that number from pi down to 2.5. And that's much closer to what I had in mind. Great. So now that's it. We are done. This is our cactus. If we move the cactus, we will get a different cactus at every position. Alternatively, if we move the control empty, that will also result in a different cactus. Congratulations on making it this far. I am very impressed that you made it this far and put up with me this entire time and put up with all this complexity. But I hope you learned something. I hope this was of some benefit to you. If so, please drop a like, drop a comment, let me know, and have a good one.